The static hit my earpiece at 0317, ship time, and I almost missed it. I had been awake for 19 hours straight, running diagnostics on a relay antenna that kept throwing error codes nobody else on the crew cared about. The Verdun was a supply ship. We hauled fuel cells and field rations and replacement parts for ships that actually mattered. Nobody expected anything important to happen on our deck. Nobody expected anything at all, really. That was the job. Quiet, invisible, forgotten. But the static kept coming, and something in the rhythm of it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled off my headset, rubbed my eyes, and plugged back in. It was not static. It was a signal, and it was not encrypted. I sat up straighter in my chair. Everything that moved through deep space at that frequency was encrypted. Everything. That was not a law made by humans. That was a law made by physics and common sense, and 40,000 years of interstellar protocol. Nobody sent unencrypted transmissions at that range, not unless they wanted everyone to hear. I grabbed my translation pad and started working the signal. My hands were moving before my brain had fully caught up with what I was doing. I was a communications relay technician, rank E4, assigned to a ship that had never seen combat, and probably never would. My job was to maintain the antenna array, log incoming traffic, and forward anything flagged to the duty officer. That was the whole job. 3 years of that job, and I had forwarded exactly 11 items of genuine importance. The translation took 4 minutes. The signal was long and layered and built in the way that only one kind of broadcast was built. Formal, structured, with the specific cadence of an official ruling. When the final line printed across my screen, I read it twice. Then I read it again. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my little relay booth for a long time. The Galactic Arbitration Council had just told the entire known galaxy that humanity was going to lose the war. Not might lose, not was likely to lose, would lose. Definitively, mathematically, with the full weight of 13 elder species and 40,000 years of conflict modeling behind that single conclusion. I had heard of the Council the way most people had heard of them, as a distant, almost mythological institution. They were the ones who had brokered the end of the Skarath expansion 600 years ago. They had arbitrated the dual Keth border disputes. They had watched empires rise and fall, and had, reportedly, never once gotten a probability assessment wrong. Their models were built on such an enormous base of historical data that most species simply accepted their conclusions the way you accept that the sun will rise in the morning. They were not cruel in their announcement. That was the thing that stayed with me longest, in the hours after I read it. They were not gloating. They were not threatening. The language was almost gentle, in its way. They were simply informing us, as a professional courtesy, that our situation was without a realistic path to victory. They cited specifics, logistics ratios, technology gaps, the combat record of the Keth Dominion against the 7 other species the Keth had previously absorbed. They cited what they called psychological resilience ceiling, a calculation of how much sustained pressure a species could absorb before the will to continue collapsed. Our ceiling, according to their models, was 11 months. The Keth had ended every previous conflict in fewer than 8. The Council's recommendation was that the Terran Confederacy open surrender negotiations immediately, in order to preserve as much of our civilian infrastructure and population as possible. They framed it as mercy. It probably was. I sat in my relay booth and felt the silence of the ship around me. 240 people on the Verdun. Crew sleeping in their bunks. Crew playing cards in the lower mess. Crew running the overnight maintenance cycles that kept a 30-year-old supply ship held together with expertise and stubbornness. None of them knew what I had just read. I thought about my brother, Owen. He was infantry, stationed on the outer defensive line near the Keth approach corridor. He had sent me a voice message 3 days ago, laughing about how bad the food was, and asking if I could smuggle him better coffee through the supply chain. I had been meaning to reply. I looked at the Council's assessment one more time. 11 months. A species with a perfect record of prediction. A war machine that had never failed to grind down a species' will to resist. The math laid out with the kind of calm precision that made it feel inevitable. I opened a message to Owen and typed for about 30 seconds. Then I deleted most of it. What I kept was short. Whatever happens, I wrote, do not surrender. Whatever you hear, whatever they tell you, whatever the numbers say, Do not stop. I sent it before I could second-guess myself. Then I flagged the council's transmission for the duty officer, logged it in the system, and sat quietly as the implications of what I had read continued to settle through me like cold water finding its way through rock. The thing that bothered me most was not the conclusion, it was the confidence. The council had not said they were probably right. They had not hedged, not offered alternative scenarios, not left any room at all for the possibility that they had missed something. In 40,000 years of doing this, they had apparently never needed to. They had watched species after species go through exactly the same process: initial resistance, sustained pressure, psychological collapse, negotiated surrender, and their models had captured every variation of that process with perfect accuracy. They had looked at humanity and run the same model. What they had not done, as far as I could tell from the full text of their assessment, was spend very much time asking why their model had worked on every species it had ever been applied to. They had never had reason to. When you have never been wrong, you stop looking for the ways you might be wrong. I had grown up in a small town in the north of England, in a house where the boiler broke every winter, and my father fixed it every winter, for 22 years, with whatever was available. Spare parts from other appliances. Improvised solutions that no plumber would have recognized as legitimate. The boiler should have been replaced when I was 4 years old. It was still running when I left for service at 21. Every repair was different because every failure was different, and my father simply kept adapting until the thing worked. I thought about that boiler for a long time in the quiet of my relay booth. Then the duty officer's acknowledgement came back on my screen, marked urgent, and the ship began to wake up. The next 12 hours were noise and movement, and briefings that I was not senior enough to attend but close enough to overhear. The Council's transmission had arrived simultaneously at every major fleet command. The Admiralty was already in emergency session. On the public feeds, politicians were making statements. On the unofficial feeds, the crew channels, the private forums, the message boards that technically did not exist, humans were doing what they always did with news like this. They were arguing about it. Some people were afraid. Some people were angry. Some people were already making jokes. One crew member on our lower deck, a mechanic named Gary, had apparently printed out the Council's probability estimate and stuck it to the wall of the engine room with the words, "Challenge accepted," written underneath in black marker. I did not find out about the marker until later, but when I did, I thought that if the Council had somehow been able to read that engine room wall, they might have understood slightly better where their model had gone wrong. Not that they knew it had gone wrong yet. That part was coming. I did not sleep that night. I stayed at my console and logged every transmission that came through the array, and I thought about my brother on the front line, and I thought about the Council's 11-month estimate, and I thought about my father and the boiler. At some point around dawn, ship time, I realized that I was not afraid. I was not sure what I was. Something quieter than fear and sharper than confidence. Something that sits in the chest and waits. The Keth Dominion was the most efficient military force in the recorded history of interstellar conflict. They did not make mistakes. They did not overextend. They had absorbed 7 species into their dominion without losing a single major engagement, and they had done it not through overwhelming force, but through a precise and patient process of wearing down the will of their opponents until resistance became something no one could remember the point of. They had a plan for us. The Council had reviewed it and found it sound. The plan was already in motion. What nobody in that council chamber had thought to consider, as they delivered their careful and well-intentioned announcement, was what happens to a plan built around breaking something that does not break the way other things do. I found out the answer to that question over the following weeks. So did the Keth. But on that first night, in my little relay booth that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, I just sat quietly and listened to the static between stars and thought about boilers. And I sent my brother another message, just one line this time. "We are going to be fine," I wrote. I did not know then how right I was, or how completely wrong the Council was about to be proven, for the first and only time in their 40,000-year history. I know now. This is what happened. The Keth moved on schedule. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not that they attacked, but that they attacked exactly when the Council's models said they would, in exactly the formation their historical record suggested, with exactly the strategic intent that 7 previous campaigns had established as their signature approach. They were not hiding anything. They did not need to. Their method had never failed. From my relay booth aboard the Verdun, now repositioned as part of a logistics support cluster near the outer edge of the conflict zone, I had a view of the war that almost no one else had. Not a frontline view, not a command view. Something stranger than either of those. A view from inside the communication network itself. Every signal that moved through my array left a trace. Fleet orders, supply requests, casualty figures, diplomatic traffic, intelligence assessments, and woven through all of it, like a second signal running underneath the first, the constant chatter of every species watching the war unfold. The Keth High Command's internal communications were encoded, but not with anything that our cryptographic teams had not already mapped during the preparatory weeks. I was not supposed to have access to the translated feeds. That was strictly a command-level clearance. But the Verdun's captain, a woman named Louise Hargreaves who had the particular gift of pretending not to notice things she had unofficially authorized, had assigned me to monitor all traffic relevant to supply chain integrity, and she had written the authorization with enough deliberate vagueness that I had interpreted it as broadly as I possibly could. Louise never asked me what I was reading. I never told her. We had an arrangement based entirely on shared curiosity and plausible deniability, and it worked well for both of us. What I was reading, in those first weeks of the war, was the Keth's confusion. They had launched their grinding campaign exactly as planned. Pressure on the outer defensive lines, disruption of supply routes, a deliberate, methodical increase in the cost of resistance, not designed to destroy the Terran Confederacy's military capacity, but to make continuing the fight feel pointless. The Keth were not trying to win quickly. They were trying to make us decide to lose. And the humans on the front line were not deciding to lose. The Keth's internal assessments in the first week were confident. Minor deviations from the model, within expected parameters. The second week, still confident, but with some notations about unexpected logistics adaptation on the human side. By the third week, the tone had shifted in a way that I found quietly fascinating. The word the translation rendered as anomalous started appearing with increasing frequency. What was anomalous, as near as I could understand from the data, was that we kept finding ways around things. The Keth disrupted a major fuel supply route. Within 4 days, the human logistics teams had opened 3 alternative routes, 2 of which had not existed the week before. The Keth increased pressure on a defensive position. The human units holding it did not retreat or break. They dug in and sent a supply request for more ammunition, phrased in a tone that the communications officer described, in her forwarding note, as almost cheerful. The Keth hit a civilian manufacturing hub. It was back at 60% capacity within a week. The Keth could not understand how. Their models accounted for repair capacity. They had not accounted for the specific human tendency to pull in people from completely unrelated fields and improvise solutions that no trained engineer would have suggested, but that somehow worked anyway. I watched all of this through my relay array and thought about Louise, who before her commission had managed cargo shipping for a private company and who had applied the same instincts to military logistics, with results that were, by any conventional measure, impossible. She never seemed to think they were impossible. She seemed to think they were obvious, and that everyone else was simply being slow. That was the week I began to understand what the Council had missed. They had modeled us as a civilization at war, a society that had switched from peace mode to conflict mode, the way every other species in their historical record had done. A normal species has a default state and a crisis state, and the crisis state is harder to maintain because it requires more resources, more psychological energy, more sacrifice. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the crisis state outweighs the perceived benefit of continuing to resist, and the species chooses to return to normal. That was the pattern. That was what the model was built on. What the Council had not modeled, because they had never encountered it before, was a species for whom the crisis state and the normal state were the same state. Humans had been in conflict with something for the entirety of their recorded history. Conflict with nature, with disease, with each other, with the limits of their own biology and technology and understanding. There was no baseline peace state stored somewhere in our collective memory that we were trying to return to. There was just the work in front of us. and the instinct to keep going at it until it was done. The Keth's entire strategy was built on making us want to stop, but wanting to stop required imagining a version of things where stopping was better than continuing. And humans, it turned out, were very bad at imagining that version. Not because we were noble or heroic or particularly brave as individuals, but because stopping felt deeply unnatural in a way that was almost impossible to explain to a species that had been able to stop for long stretches throughout their history. In the 4th week, I intercepted a message from a Keth strategic analyst to his commanding admiral. The translation was rough in places, but the meaning was clear enough. The analyst was recommending a reassessment of the psychological attrition timeline. The humans, he wrote, were not responding to pressure the way the model predicted. They were adapting too quickly and showing no signs of the expected morale decline. His recommendation was to increase pressure significantly and move to Phase 2 of the grinding campaign ahead of schedule. The Admiral approved it. I forwarded the relevant portions to Louise, within the creative interpretation of my authorization, and she read them over coffee without any visible reaction. Then she looked at me and said, "Tell the supply teams on Corridor 7 to expect heavier demand in the next 10 days, and see if we can get an additional fuel reserve positioned at Waypoint 4. I asked her how she knew which corridor and which waypoint. She said, "Because if I were them, that is where I would push." Then she went back to her logistics screens. The Keth pushed exactly there. The supply teams on Corridor 7 were ready. The fuel reserve at Waypoint 4 was already in place. The push did not achieve what the Keth had intended. In the 5th week, the Keth's internal communications started using a word that our translation system rendered as something between frustrating and inexplicable. The tone in their assessments had changed again. The confidence was still there, but it had become the kind of confidence that has started working harder than it used to. The kind that keeps reassuring itself because reassurance has become necessary. The Council had set their original timeline at 11 months. The Keth had never needed more than 8 with any previous opponent. 5 weeks in, they were already running behind their own internal schedule and had not achieved any of the psychological markers that should have been appearing by that point. They increased pressure again. We absorbed it. I want to be clear about something, because I have seen accounts of this period that make it sound like the early weeks were easy, or that no one was suffering. They were not easy. People were getting hurt out there. Owen sent me messages that were shorter than his usual ones, and when I read between the lines of his careful, cheerful sentences, I could tell that things on the front line were hard, in ways he was trying not to worry me with. Supply ships were being targeted. Logistics runs that should have been routine were not. People on our own crew were working hours that no regulation would have approved, and they were doing it without complaint because complaining felt like the wrong response to the situation. I do not want to make this sound like humanity walked through the early weeks without cost. We did not. But the thing the Keth could not understand, the thing that was quietly destroying their timeline, was that the cost was being paid, and the work was continuing anyway. The suffering was real, and the resistance was also real, and neither of those facts canceled out the other. In the 6th week, something happened that I did not expect. I received a personal message from Owen. Not a voice message this time, a written one, which he almost never sent. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence said that he was fine. The second sentence said that the unit next to his had developed a method for intercepting Keth communication signals using repurposed equipment from their mobile field kitchen, and that it had been working surprisingly well. The third sentence said, "Tell me honestly, do you think we are going to win this?" I sat with that message for a long time. The honest answer, if I was being purely rational, was that I did not know. The Keth were still formidable. Our losses were real. The Council's assessment had not been made up. The math was genuinely unfavorable on paper. But I had spent 6 weeks watching what happened when that math met actual humans in actual situations, and I had watched the gap between what the model predicted and what was actually happening get wider every single week. And I had watched Louise Hargreaves anticipate every Keth move from a logistics desk on a supply ship while drinking questionable coffee. And I had read the Keth analyst's own words and heard the note of confusion that had crept into them, the note of something that was not quite worry yet, but was beginning to remember what worry felt like. I wrote back to Owen, "Yes, just that, one word. He sent back a short voice message, laughing. He said I sounded very sure for someone who drove a supply ship. I said I had been reading a lot. He said he had been doing something similar, except with Keth artillery patterns instead of communications data, and that the patterns had a very specific kind of predictability to them, the kind you get when something has always worked before, and nobody thought to plan for it not working. I told him that was one of the most insightful things he had ever said. He told me to get some sleep. I did not get any sleep. I went back to my console and kept reading. The 7th week was when the Keth formally requested a reassessment session from the Galactic Arbitration Council. It was phrased diplomatically, framed as a routine mid-conflict review, but the request itself was already an anomaly. In every previous Keth campaign, no mid-conflict review had been necessary, because the outcome had already been decided by week 7. The momentum was always established. The enemy's will was always measurably declining. Ours was not declining. The request went out on a standard council frequency. I logged it, flagged it, and sat very quietly for a moment. Then I went and knocked on Louise's cabin door and told her what I had just read. She opened the door. She was still in her uniform. She had probably not slept either. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Good." Just that word. I asked her what she thought the council would do. She said, "I think the council is about to discover that their models have a very specific kind of problem. The kind you only find when you test the model against something it was never built to account for." I asked her what kind of problem that was. She picked up her coffee, looked at it, put it back down. "The kind," she said, "where the assumption that made the model reliable is the same assumption that makes the model wrong, in exactly the right circumstances." Then she told me to get some rest before my next shift. I went back to my booth. I did not rest. The reassessment session was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, something was already in motion that I did not know about yet. Something quiet and small and brilliantly specific that a handful of people had been building in the space between all the noise of the front line, while the Keth were watching the wrong direction and the council was preparing their updated probability charts. I did not know about it yet. I found out during the session. Everyone did. The session was not supposed to be a public event. Galactic Arbitration Council proceedings at the mid-conflict stage were typically closed, recorded for the historical archive, distributed to involved parties afterward, but not broadcast live. The council had their reasons for this. Live broadcasts introduced pressure and posturing into what was meant to be a calm, evidence-based process. They had found, over 40,000 years of doing this, that closed sessions produced better outcomes. What the council had not anticipated was that a human communications technician on a supply ship had, through 7 weeks of creative interpretation of a broadly worded authorization, and a captain who had mastered the art of looking the other way, built a relay configuration that technically intercepted everything. I want to be clear that I had not planned to listen to the session live. I had planned to catch the recorded version once it was distributed, but when the signal opened at 0600, ship time, it came through my array the same way everything else did, and I was already at my console, and it would have felt almost wrong not to listen. Louise came in quietly about 10 minutes after it started, and sat down in the second chair without saying anything. She had a cup of something that was no longer actually coffee, but which she called coffee anyway. She read the translated transcript as it scrolled across my secondary screen. Neither of us spoke. The first hour of the session was the Keth presentation. It was meticulous and precise, and delivered with the kind of controlled professionalism that 7 successful campaigns had given them. They acknowledged the timeline deviation. They presented updated modeling that accounted for the human adaptation factor. They had now begun quantifying it, giving it a name in their language that translated roughly as irrational persistence index. They argued that the persistence was real but not decisive. Their revised estimate gave the grinding campaign 14 months instead of 11, but maintained the same fundamental conclusion. The Terran Confederacy would reach a breaking point. All species reached a breaking point. The Council reviewed the updated models. They asked clarifying questions. One of the elder representatives from a species called the Tavith, who had, I had learned, been arbitrating conflicts for over 30,000 years, spent a long time on the updated persistence metrics. asking the Keth analysts to explain the mechanism by which they expected the persistence to eventually decline. The Keth analyst explained it the way you explain something obvious to someone who is asking a question you did not expect. Sustained pressure, he said, always produced eventual psychological collapse. There was no species in the historical record that had maintained indefinite resistance against sufficient external pressure. The question was never whether the resistance would break, only when. Their models calculated the when with precision. The adjustment was simply a recalibration of that timeline. The Tavith representative said, "Noted," and moved on. Then it was the human delegation's turn. Admiral Caroline Webb had the kind of face that gave away very little. I had seen her in broadcast footage before, press conferences, fleet addresses, the kind of public communication that military leadership required. She was economical with words, in a way that made every word carry more weight. She sat down in the session chair and looked at the council's panel, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We appreciate the council's continued attention to this matter. We have a brief statement." Brief, it turned out, was an understatement. 4 words. That was all she said. We already ended it. The silence that followed those 4 words was the most interesting silence I had ever heard transmitted across deep space. Because silence in a communication signal is not just the absence of sound, it carries texture. The silence from the council panel lasted 11 full seconds, which in a formal arbitration session might as well have been an hour, and it had the texture of 11 different species trying to locate a reference point for something that had no reference point. Then the Keth chief strategist said, "Clarify," and Admiral Webb said, "The Verdant protocol was completed at 0312 this morning. You can run the verification independently. The Keth command and control network is currently in a state of full authentication lockout across all command levels. Fleet orders cannot be transmitted or received. Strategic coordination is not possible. The condition is stable and non-destructive. No Keth systems were harmed. They are simply waiting." Another silence. Shorter this time. 9 seconds. Then, every delegate in the room started talking at once, and my translation system, which was good but not perfect, started throwing up 3 simultaneous threads of conversation, and I had to switch to the clean audio channel and work through the chaos manually. I sat very still. Louise, beside me, set down her coffee and said quietly, "There it is." I looked at her. She was reading the transcript with the expression of someone recognizing the answer to a question she had been sitting with for a while. "Did you know?" I asked. "I knew something was being built," she said. "I did not know the specifics. Command kept it very quiet, which was the right call." I turned back to my screen and kept reading. The verification came in over the next 40 minutes, delivered by 3 independent monitoring bodies the Council had dispatched at speed. All 3 confirmed the same thing. The Keth Dominion's command network, the system they had built and refined and depended upon for 600 years of interstellar operations, was locked in what the technical report described as a recursive authentication failure. Every node in the network was waiting for confirmation from another node. Every other node was waiting for the same thing in return. Nothing was broken. Nothing was destroyed. The whole system was simply frozen, waiting for a handshake that could not come, because every potential handshake partner was also waiting. The technical term in the report was mutual dependency deadlock. The human term, the one that circulated through the fleet's private channels within hours, was considerably less formal. The operation, what came to be called the Verdant Protocol, had been designed and executed by a team of 7 people over a period of 11 weeks. They had identified a fundamental architectural assumption in the Keth's network, that confirmation messages were always trustworthy, because in 600 years of Keth operations, there had never been a reason to doubt them. The network had been optimized for speed and reliability over that period, and part of that optimization had quietly removed certain redundancy checks that older versions of the system had included as safeguards. The 7 people on the team had found the exact sequence of signals that would trigger every node in the network to request simultaneous confirmation at the same moment. It was not a weapon. It did not destroy anything. It was closer, in spirit, to a very carefully placed question that the entire network had to answer at once, and could not, because answering required the cooperation of the very nodes that were asking the same question. One member of the team, a woman named Priya Lawson, who had worked in network security before her commission, and who had also, I later learned, spent 4 years doing competitive puzzle design as a hobby, had been the one to identify the specific sequence. She had described her approach in the internal briefing notes, which eventually became part of the official record, as looking for the thing that the system trusted completely, because it had never needed to distrust it. The Keth had built their network to be fast. They had built it to be reliable. They had optimized it across 600 years into something elegant and highly efficient. What they had not built it to do was question itself. Priya Lawson had found the one moment in which it would have to. In the session chamber, the Keth ambassador was very quiet for a long time. When he spoke, the translation came through with the particular quality of words being chosen very carefully. He asked how. Admiral Webb said, "We have been doing this to ourselves for centuries. Every network we build, we break. Every system we create, we find the flaw. Not always on purpose, sometimes just by accident, but we have a long history of being on both sides of this kind of failure, and eventually, you learn to think the way the failure thinks." The Tavith representative asked for a recess. The council went to closed deliberation. They were in there for 4 hours. My shift technically ended 2 hours into the wait. I did not move from my console. Louise stayed as well. We did not talk much. Occasionally, she would note something in her logistics system. Occasionally, I would flag a transmission. The ship moved around us in its normal rhythms, crew going about their duties, the quiet machinery of a vessel doing its work. When the council came back, the lead representative spoke for a long time. The summary of it, distilled through the translation and through my own processing of the language, was this. They were not certain how to proceed. The situation was without precedent. The Keth Dominion had formally requested conflict status review. The human delegation had presented verified evidence that the conflict had effectively been resolved through a non-lethal network interdiction. The question before the council was whether this constituted a legitimate conclusion to the conflict under their arbitration protocols. It took them another 6 hours to conclude that it did. The Keth network lockout was cleared over the following 12 days. The humans offered to assist with the process, which some people in the fleet thought was too generous, and which Admiral Webb described simply as the practical choice. The clearing process required cooperation between Keth network engineers and a small human team, and that cooperation was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it worked. Owen sent me a message during the clearing process. He said his unit had been told to stand down from active posture, and were now mostly sitting around playing cards and trying to figure out what to do with all the extra ammunition they had requested. He said the food was still bad. I wrote back and told him to come home soon. He said, "Did we really just win because someone found a bug in their network?" I said, "We won because someone knew exactly what kind of thing to look for, and why. That is not the same as luck." He did not respond immediately, but when he did, he said, "Priya Lawson." I looked her up. She was a puzzle designer. I said yes. He said, "That might be the most human thing I have ever heard." The council released their formal record amendment 2 weeks after the session. It was 700 pages, mostly technical and historical analysis, building toward a conclusion that everyone in the diplomatic community was already discussing before the document was even published. The last substantive line, before the appendices, was the one that ended up being quoted most widely, and for the longest time afterward. It said, "The Terran Confederacy's behavior under attrition conditions is not consistent with any previously observed sapient species. New modeling frameworks are required." I read that line on my console, in my relay booth, at the end of a very long shift. I printed it on paper. We had a small printer on the Verdun, technically a maintenance logbook printer, technically not for personal use. Louise had been technically not noticing its personal use for 2 years. I put the printout above my console. The weeks after the council's amendment were strange, in a way that is hard to describe, without sounding like I expected a different kind of ending. The war was over. That was the fact of it, clear and confirmed, and filed in the official record of the Galactic Arbitration Council for every species in the known galaxy to read. The Keth Dominion, whose military machine had never in 600 years been stopped before it wanted to stop, had been brought to a standstill by 7 people, and a puzzle designer's understanding of how networks fail. The Council had revised their probability assessment for the first time in their 40,000-year history. Everything that needed to happen had happened. And yet the ship kept running. The maintenance cycles kept cycling. The logistics requests kept coming in. And Louise kept managing them with the same quiet efficiency she had applied throughout the war. People ate their meals and ran their drills and slept in their bunks. And the Verdun moved through space doing what it had always done, carrying things from one place to another because things needed to be carried. I stayed at my console and logged transmissions, the way I always had. Owen came home 6 weeks after the ceasefire was formalized. I met him at the transit hub on Meridian Station, which was the closest port to both our assignments. He was thinner than I remembered, and he walked with the particular kind of careful deliberateness that people carry when they have been in places where deliberateness mattered. He hugged me for a longer time than he usually would have, without saying anything. Then he pulled back and looked at me and said, "You sent me that message. The first one. Do not surrender." I said yes. He said, "Before any of this happened, before any of the council stuff came out publicly, you sent that in the middle of the night." I said, "I had been reading." He said, "What did you know?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the council's transmission, cold and precise and certain. I thought about Louise moving supply lines with the instincts of someone who had spent her life moving things efficiently. I thought about Gary the mechanic and his marker and his wall. I thought about Owen's message about the field kitchen and the repurposed signals equipment, and about Priya Lawson finding the flaw in a 600-year-old network because she had spent years looking for the flaws in things. I did not know how to compress all of that into a clean answer, so I said the thing that was closest to true. I knew that the council built their model on the assumption that our situation was comparable to situations they had seen before, I said, and I thought they were wrong about that. I did not know exactly why, but I had a strong feeling that if we just kept going, the reason would become clear eventually. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could have just said you had a gut feeling." I said, "It was a very well-informed gut feeling." He laughed at that, not the careful, restrained laugh he had carried when he first arrived, a real one, the kind I remembered from before everything. We found a place to eat. The food was significantly better than whatever he had been surviving on at the front line, which he noted with the specific appreciation of someone reacquainting themselves with the concept of flavor. We talked for a long time, not about the war as a whole, not about the Verdant Protocol or the Council or the Keth network architecture, mostly about small things, what people we knew were doing, what came next, what he was thinking about for his next posting, what I was going to do with the printout above my console when I eventually transferred off the Verdun. I told him I was going to keep it, wherever I ended up. He asked me why that particular line. I said, "Because they admitted they needed a new model. That is rarer than winning a war. Most people, and most institutions, when they are wrong about something important, find a way to explain the wrongness without actually updating anything fundamental." The council looked at what happened and said, "In 40,000 years, we have never seen this before, and therefore we have to build something new to account for it." Owen thought about this. He dipped a piece of bread into something warm and ate it slowly. "Is that why you think it matters?" he said. "The model thing?" "I think it matters," I said, "because the next time someone looks at us and runs a calculation and concludes that we cannot do something, the calculation is going to be slightly different, and the time after that, slightly different again. And eventually the gap between what the model predicts and what actually happens is going to be large enough that the model stops being a prediction and starts being a guess." He looked at me for a moment. "You have been thinking about this for a while." 7 weeks in a relay booth, I said, with very slow shifts. He smiled at that. He asked about Louise. I told him she had already been offered a promotion and had turned it down, on the grounds that she would rather keep running the Verdun's logistics than sit in a command room writing reports. He said that sounded exactly right. I said I agreed. The station around us was busy, in the way that stations become busy in the weeks after a conflict ends. People moving, things being transported, the vast unglamorous machinery of a civilization, resettling itself back into its normal patterns. Across the transit hub, I could see a news screen cycling through coverage of the ceasefire. Someone had done a graphic with the 5-minute figure, 4 minutes and 53 seconds actually, but 5 minutes was what the news had decided on, and it was already becoming the shorthand that everyone used when they talked about this. 5 minutes. The Alien Council had predicted 11 months. Humanity ended it in 5 minutes. That was true, in the narrow sense. The Verdant Protocol had taken 4 minutes and 53 seconds to execute, but the 5 minutes did not happen on their own. They happened because of the 7 weeks of holding the line while the protocol was being built. They happened because of Louise managing supply routes with impossible efficiency. They happened because of Owen's unit and every other unit that absorbed the pressure without breaking. They happened because of Gary and his marker. They happened because of Priya Lawson and the years she spent learning to think the way failures think. The 5 minutes were the visible part. The rest of it was all the invisible, grinding, unglamorous human work that made the 5 minutes possible. I did not try to explain all of that to Owen. He had been there for his part of it. He understood already. The news screen cycled to a segment about the Council's new modeling initiative. They had apparently commissioned a formal research program to study human behavioral patterns under conflict conditions. 3 species were jointly contributing to it. It was going to take, by the estimate they had given to the press, about 15 years to produce preliminary results. Owen watched the screen for a moment. 15 years, he said. They want to be thorough, I said. Do you think they will get it right? The model? I thought about that. I thought about everything I had read and watched and logged over those weeks in my relay booth. I thought about all the ways that humans had confounded predictions, not by being strategic or deliberate about it, but simply by doing what felt natural, which was to keep going, keep adapting, keep finding the way through. I think they will get closer, I said. Closer than before. I think the model will be better. But not right? I shook my head. I do not think a model that predicts human behavior can ever be completely right, because the behavior is not following rules, it is just following itself, and the self keeps changing. Owen nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something, then decided against it, then decided to say it anyway. In the last week before the ceasefire, he said, the Keth units near us just stopped, not retreating, not regrouping, just stopped. And someone in my unit, a woman named Claire, she said that they probably did not know what to do next, that their plan had only had one failure mode built in, and this was not that failure mode. He paused, and I thought about that a lot, that they had only planned for one way to be wrong, and we had been wrong in so many different ways for so many years that being wrong had stopped feeling like the same thing to us. Being wrong was just Tuesday. Being wrong was the beginning of figuring out what came next. I looked at my brother. He had grown thoughtful in ways that the front line had apparently encouraged. That, I said, is exactly what the Council's model did not account for. He finished his bread. The station hummed around us. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars they always were, distant and indifferent, and not particularly interested in the specifics of which species had won or lost, or been forced to revise their 40,000-year-old probability frameworks. But somewhere out there, in the archives of the Galactic Arbitration Council, for the first time in recorded interstellar history, there was a document that said, "We were wrong. This species does not fit the model. New thinking is required." That was not a small thing. That was, in its own quiet way, the most significant outcome of the whole conflict, not the ceasefire, not the Verdant Protocol, not the 5 minutes that everyone was going to talk about for generations. The moment the longest-running unbroken record in galactic history ended. The moment the Council had to sit down and admit that something existed that their models had never accounted for. I went back to the Verdun 2 days later. I sat down at my console in my relay booth that smelled of recycled air and old coffee. The printout was still above my console. Louise was at her desk down the corridor, running logistics for the next supply run as though nothing in particular had changed, which was exactly the right attitude to have. I opened my transmission log. I put on my headset. The static of deep space filled my ears, the same static it always was, the background noise of a universe that did not know or care what had just happened. I thought about the Council, in their chamber, beginning the long work of building a new model. I thought about what they were going to find, the deeper they went. Not a flaw in the old model. Not a mistake. Just a gap. A space where a species had existed that was unlike anything the model had been built to account for. A species that had learned, through no particular intention but simply through long experience, to treat impossibility as a temporary state. I logged in for my shift. Somewhere on Meridian Station, Owen was eating something with actual flavor and sleeping in a bunk that did not require hearing protection. Somewhere in a research lab, Priya Lawson was probably already working on the next problem. That was the thing about people who thought the way failures thought. They were never short of material. And in the relay booth of a supply ship that smelled of recycled air and bad coffee, a communications technician named Aaron Marsh sat at his console and listened to the static between stars and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not tension or vigilance or carefully managed uncertainty. He felt quiet. The good kind. The kind that comes after.